So, two young Jewish students, Mo and Lenny, were strolling home from shul, or school, on Saturday morning. Suddenly a cab speeds past and their friend Irving is running frantically behind it, his arms waving wildly. Well, says Lenny, I never imagined our good friend Irving was such a Sabbath violator. Look at him running for that taxi. Wait a minute, Mo replied. Didn't you read that book that I lent you, The Other Side of the Story? About the command to look with compassion on other people? I bet we can think of 100 excuses for Irving's behavior. Yeah, like what? Well, maybe he's sick and he needs to get to the hospital. Oh, come on. He was running 60 miles an hour behind that cab. He's healthier than Arnold Schwarzenegger. Well, maybe his wife is having a baby. She had one last week. Well, maybe he needs to visit her in the hospital. She's home. Well, maybe he's running to the hospital to get a doctor. He's a doctor. Well, maybe he needs supplies from the hospital. The hospital is a 3-minute walk in the opposite direction. Well, maybe he forgot it's the Sabbath. Of course he knows it's the Sabbath. Didn't you see his tie? It was his paisley beige, 100% silk Giovanni tie from Italy. He never wears it during the week. He only wears it on the Sabbath. Wow, you're really observant. I didn't even notice he was wearing a tie. How could you not notice? Didn't you see how it was caught on the back fender of that taxi? We get our understanding of the Sabbath day from the creation story. And that understanding of the Sabbath day continues through our Judeo-Christian heritage. The Sabbath day tells us the earth was made, the creation story rather, tells us that the earth was made in 6 days, and on the 7th day God rested. So our Judeo-Christian tradition teaches us, so should we. Now, Christianity is the largest religion on the planet by far. But following the Jewish tradition of rest on the Sabbath, until the last 30 years or so, stores were not open on the Sabbath day. Schools did not facilitate organized activities on the Sabbath day. Sunday meals were largely prepared on the day before the Christian Sabbath day. Those were the rules that were handed down to us. Now, you and I are people given to rules. We go to an office during office hours. We show up for business during business hours. And we don't expect someone to be in some place to help us when that place is not doing business. And when we're in church, we abide by rules. When it's singing time, we sing. When it's greeting time, we greet. When it's praying time, we pray. Even though we say we welcome all just as they are, and we really try to, we really get uncomfortable with concerns come into our worship space and break the rules. There is a hymn that tropes, when the Church of Jesus shuts its outer door, lest the roar of traffic drown the voice of prayer. Lord, make us 10 times more aware that the world that we banish, that is our Christian care. A few years ago in this beautiful sanctuary, we had planned a wonderful Palm Sunday service. The music was lovely and welcoming. The congregation was all turned out and a little giddy because Easter was the next week. The palm fronds were reaching up to the ceiling like they do every week. The choir was primed to sing as never before. I was feeling really good about my message. And then our dear friend Hal Whitfield, who always came to worship in a suit that made me look like a pauper, who always stopped to compliment me on how well he thought my sermon had gone that morning, who had never failed to attend this worship service of Little White Chapel ever since he had started a few months before. Right in the middle of that extremely orderly service, our dear friend Hal Whitfield had a major heart attack and lay there in the aisle. Oh, an ambulance was quickly dispatched. First aid was given right here in the building by able hands and fingers, doing all they could do. Now, my first inclination was to alter the service right there and form a circle around him and pray. But I immediately questioned myself. Was that too African American church? Was that too black church to do that? How would my members feel about that? The choir had prepared such beautiful Palm Sunday music, and there was so much going on in the service. For all intents and purposes, Hal really passed away right here in our sanctuary. But somehow, between the first aid he received here at the church and the first responders who came in the ambulance, Hal was revived at the hospital. Well, as soon as the service was over, I and one of the elders rushed to the hospital, and we got to speak to him. And Hal seemed to be doing fine. So fine, in fact, that he apologized to us for disrupting the orderly service. He was thankful that one of our members had the audacity, and she had met his daughter the night before, and she had written down the phone number. And so our member, when she had the phone number, we were able to get in touch with the daughter, and the daughter was able to meet us at the hospital and be with her father. And everything seemed to be going fine, except that he had a deep, disturbing, rasping cough. Again, as I said, he apologized for disrupting the service here at Little White Chapel, and we had that prayer. Annette, you and I, and we all joined hands, and we prayed a proper prayer for him in the hospital, and we wished him well. And we left the hospital thinking that we had not disrupted the service and that we had ministered to one of our members. About an hour after we left the hospital, and about an hour and a half after our wonderful orderly service here at White Chapel, Hal passed away. In this Jesus story that Fred read to us, this dear sister had been quietly suffering for 18 years, crippled and bent over. It had been 18 years since the rain had fallen fresh on her face. 18 years since the sun had tanned her skin. She was so bent over that all she saw was the dust and the dirt of other people's feet. Now, the Judeo tradition, which had been passed down to many of us in this Christian tradition, unfortunately is that if you were suffering in that way, it was God's will. You or somebody in your family had done something that caused God to turn God's back on you and punish you. So according to ancient tradition, God was punishing her for 18 years for something that had happened in her family. Even Jesus, the one who could heal anybody, wasn't in the business of healing everybody. But 21st century songwriter Leonard Cohen once said, "There is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in." And there was a crack in that synagogue's armor. First of all, this Son of God and Son of Man, who had never been to rabbinical school, but knew God better than anybody who had ever lived, was teaching. Jesus once said, "I and the Father are one." Another time he said, "Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father." There was a big crack in that traditional synagogue. A crack big enough for a sickly, broken down, and therefore unclean, unwelcome woman to slip right into that holy, orderly synagogue where this rogue rabbi was preaching and teaching. By all accounts, she shouldn't have been welcome. Somebody at the door let her slip by. All of the rules said she wasn't welcome. But unlike me, when Jesus saw her, he broke all the rules. He didn't care anything for order. He stopped everything and called her over and spoke in the language that those in the temple could understand. He said, "Woman, the spirit that has persecuted you for 18 years no longer has any power over you. You are set free from your ailment." And as Fred read in our presence, she stood up straight and began to praise God. Jesus says to us today, there is no need to continue with things the way they are when people are hurting. Jesus was saying that all of us are freed from our faulty Sabbath day notions that God is the God of punishment and vengeance. Jesus is saying that we need to free our heads and our hearts from the notion that there is only one way to do things. That is what all those teachings, that is what all those miracles and the surrendering of that sacred life have come to show us. In this place, in your life, those old laws no longer prevail. Somebody said in the service today, religion was turned on its heel. You and I are in the business of doing good for anybody at any time. Theologian Dr. Kathy Black says all worship is performance. And worship performance, whether it's in a synagogue or in a church or out on a sidewalk, allows God to reform us in God's image. That's doing good. The resurrection reminds us that we are formed not to rehearse the pain and misery through which humans go and blame it on their lack of holiness. Oh, you're suffering because you're not holy enough. That's the old side of the story. The other side of the story is this. We are called to be God's hands and feet, and right where we are, do something new to alleviate someone else's pain and suffering. Every time we gather around this table, whether we put out pancake mix in front of it, or flowers, or soap, or little children, every time we put out our hands saying that people are more important than anything anybody has planned, we are telling again the story of how Jesus came to reintroduce us to God. That's what we do every Sunday when we come to church. We tell again the story of how Jesus came to reintroduce us to God. Jesus tells us that life happens. Life's pain and life's suffering happens, and it's all random. But the good news, the other side of the story is this. The love of Jesus is available to go with any of us, anywhere we go. That's the other side of the story.